Are you ready, kids?
Hey guys, PIEGUYRULZ here, and welcome to every episode of SpongeBob Season 10 Reviewed. As of this video, I will have spent 6 years reviewing 10 seasons of SpongeBob. By now, of course, I'm sure you get the drill. I have a pretty large backlog of SpongeBob-related videos if you want to hear me elaborate on any of the topics I talk about in this season-long review. Additionally, I launched my very first non-SpongeBob Every Episode Reviewed project in every episode of Teen Titans Reviewed, so check that out if you haven't yet. And as always, if this video is too long for you, or you just want to skip around to any individual review, there are timestamps in the description that you can click on to skip around in this video. I went into Season 10 completely blind, not having seen anything before working on this video. And really, the only thing I have to do to set up this season is just say that it is indeed a shorter season. The shortest season that SpongeBob has ever had, at a mere 11 half hours. This is still a side effect of the SpongeBob second movie taking up so much production focus that not only did it disrupt Season 9, but it also shortened Season 10. But the long and short of it is indeed a shorter season. One of my running hypotheses about this show is that it got really bad when Nickelodeon ordered more episodes per season, going from 20 half hours for the first 5 seasons to 26 half hours in Season 6. Technically more than that even if you count the extended cut of Truth or Square. But yeah, I've always thought that that has contributed to SpongeBob's downfall because the more episodes you have to produce, the less attention the people that are overseeing the entire season can pay to each individual episode. So, is Season 10 the best season of SpongeBob yet? Oh, come on, you know the answer to that one. But it's entirely possible that Season 10 is indeed a good season. Let's dive in and find out. Episode 205A, Whirly Brains. SpongeBob and Patrick fly their brains into a cranky old man's yard. I'm going to start off by talking about the biggest strength in this episode, and that is its visual presentation. This episode looks great. There are so many great faces that the characters make, and everything seems to be exaggerated and kinetic in a really good way. It reminds me of Fear of a Krabby Patty because this episode does look visually distinct even from the rest of the episodes in the season. The bad news is that, by and large, that's the only nice thing I have to say about this episode. The other cool thing, of course, is that Mr. Krabs and Mrs. Puff are on a date, and they acknowledge the fact that their relationship hasn't really been acknowledged in about 16 years. But other than that, I very much did not like this episode, for a number of reasons. Firstly, it falls into the category of something like Wigstruck or Slide Whistle Stooges, where the episode is focused on one thing, and they just don't do enough with it to make it justify the full 11 minutes. And it's sad, too, because Whirly Brains are obviously a stand-in for drones, and there's a lot that you can do with drones. Like flying them into places where a person can't normally go. Maybe they could have had SpongeBob and Patrick fly way above the surface or something. That's just a random thought. They didn't have to do that, but what I'm saying is that there are other ideas here that they could have gone with, but instead they go with the usual stuff of SpongeBob and Patrick annoying Squidward, causing havoc in Bikini Bottom, blah blah blah. And then let's talk about the comedy. This episode feels like it has kind of dumbed down comedy. Yes, it does have those great faces, but it feels like those faces are supposed to be the bulk of the jokes here. And then there's also gross out humor. The farty noises are kind of dumb, but I didn't find them to be too gross or anything, but the diaper gag actually genuinely made me shudder. Patrick puts a diaper inside of his head and eye sockets and says it feels squishy. Ugh. They make all sorts of puns about how they've lost their minds. It feels easy and lazy and just not very funny. I don't mind gross out humor and silly faces in moderation, but when that's the bulk of the episode, it really just feels dumbed down. Oh, and SpongeBob and Patrick spend the bulk of this episode with their eyes missing and their craniums opened up, and it's really just unsettling to see. Having the characters be off-model that much for so long is one thing, but having it be a kind of unpleasant design for that much of the episode is way too much. Additionally, it's one of those episodes where SpongeBob and Patrick spend about half the time just giggling and laughing to themselves. That alone is usually kind of annoying, but when you combine it with the fact that there just really aren't any good jokes in this thing, makes me feel like I'm watching a bad sitcom with a laugh track. The characters should not be laughing more than I am. And lastly, I just don't really understand what they're going for with this episode. It seems like it's some sort of satire about stupid fads, how if you get addicted to them, you can lose your mind in the process. Which in and of itself is not a bad message, it's one that many shows have gone with before. The problem is that instead of parodying like I don't know, fidget spinners or something that is genuinely something you can get addicted to that is just wasting your time and requires no skill or thought, they decided to pick drones, which are not a dumb hobby. Drones are something that actually requires some amount of skill. They're something that requires maintenance, and you can do really creative things with them. Drones are not just some dumb hobby that'll rot your brain. I think in a lot of cases, they can be a very healthy outlet. I don't know if this episode is trying to say that drones are a waste of time, but with all the jokes that they put in there about losing your mind, it definitely seems like that's what they're trying to say. So either they accidentally included this anti-drone message, or their moral here is just completely off base. So on pretty much all levels, I think this episode fails. It is the first ScumBob of season 10. Lackluster comedy, tons of giggling, uncomfortably off-modeled characters, a really disgusting moment, and a really confusing message. Unfortunately, it puts the season off to a bad start. Oh, and fun fact, Ed Asner guest stars as the angry old-timer, who honestly didn't leave much of an impression. Episode 205B, Mermaid Pants. SpongeBob, Patrick, Squidward, and Mr. Krabs play Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy. So this is the Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episode of the season. It seems like in order to keep the tradition alive, they've basically decided to make SpongeBob and Patrick play as these characters. My favorite gags in this episode are the fact that this security guard who looks like a frail old man turns out to just be ridiculously buff, and Squidward's random Bond villain impression. Those two got laughs out of me, but the rest of the episode didn't. But hey, there have been episodes that I've called good with only 1 or 2 laughs in them. That alone is not enough to disqualify this episode from being good. However, rating this season puts me in a weird position. This episode, very intentionally so, calls back to the very first Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, with SpongeBob and Patrick pretending to be these characters, quote-unquote fighting against Squidward. And on the one hand, this feels like the show is paying tribute to some of its roots. But then on the other hand, it really just kind of feels like we're retreading territory I've seen before. Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 1 is the most obvious connection, but both Shuffleboarding and Patrick Man also have the premise of SpongeBob and Patrick, or just Patrick, trying to be superheroes and causing a bunch of harm. The problem is that I think this episode's execution of that idea is okay. I don't think that it's great, but I don't think that it's bad either. Bringing Mr. Krabs and Squidward in to be villains in this pretend game is a good idea, but I feel like it would have been better if the characters were more into their roles from the start. It feels like the first part of this episode is just super disconnected from everything after it, and it feels like they waste too much time on setting up why Mr. Krabs is pretending to be this villain and trying to give him a motivation by robbing a bank and all of that stuff, when there really should have just been more time spent just having the characters play out this scenario. And for that reason, I'm gonna give it a very high meh. I do think that this episode has a good idea in there, and it's okay to watch. I just feel like I've seen this too many times already, and the twist on it is not used to its full potential. If you like it, I totally understand, but I just don't think it crosses that threshold. It's not original enough, it's not funny enough, and the core concept is not pushed far enough. Also, fun fact, Mr. Krabs is a comic book collector. At first, I thought this was kind of a weird place to take the character, but it does make sense considering you can collect comic books and some of them can be worth a lot. And it's a nice way to have something tie back to Mr. Krabs' main character trait while expanding his interests a little more. Does it seem a little out of character for him? Kind of, but not too badly so. Episode 206A, Unreal Estate. After Squidward convinces SpongeBob he is allergic to his pineapple, the two tour houses. This episode is not the most original out there. We've seen SpongeBob and Patrick move away in an episode last season, and Squidward has either moved away or tried to move away a few times. But despite that, it does do something different, because the story is mostly about A, Squidward tricking SpongeBob into getting out of his house, and B, the two of them touring houses. It's a little different from when SpongeBob just moved into the Krusty Krab or into the garbage behind the Krusty Krab. So it definitely does its own thing, but I wouldn't say that story is necessarily the strong point of this episode. After all, the ending is just so dumb. Why is the house a rocket ship? I mean, obviously there's got to be some twist on it. It can't just be this perfect house that Squidward gets, but why a rocket ship? That was never foreshadowed, that was never hinted at. There wasn't even like a joke early in the episode about rocket ships or any sort of explanation as to why this is here. It just seems really random. But despite that, I enjoy the comedy in it, especially in the first half. There's some good bits with the hose, some good bits with Gary fighting Squidward, and some good stuff with Squidward and the pepper grinder. Additionally, once they start looking for houses, the joke where SpongeBob's opening title sequence is changed based upon the houses he's looking at is definitely not an original one. After all, it was done in Truth or Square, but it's still a gag that made me chuckle. And I really like the physical comedy of Squidward getting smashed in the head with the house drawers. The comedy isn't amazing or anything, but it definitely gives a little bit more of an effort than some other episodes around this same time. And that effort does lead to a few laughs. It's a meh episode. It is a different take on a familiar topic, but the story does fall flat in places like at the very end, and a few good jokes aren't enough to save this one. But it's an okay episode. Whoa, mama! Everyone stay calm. We have a 206B, code yellow. SpongeBob pretends to be a doctor. Oh boy, when this episode started, I was getting flashbacks to Demolition Doofus and to the not-so-great beginning of the Two Faces of Squidward. The thought of SpongeBob being a doctor operating on Squidward sounds like it could make for a really disturbing and unpleasant episode. Fortunately though, this episode is actually quite different from Demolition Doofus and a lot of the other episodes where SpongeBob ignorantly causes a lot of harm to people. See, ordinarily, SpongeBob does wacky things and a ton of people get hurt, often leading to an unhappy and bad ending for Squidward or Mrs. Puff or the random townfish or whoever. But in this case, the episode does a great job balancing SpongeBob doing harm and SpongeBob helping people. He does help Mrs. Puff puff up again, even though he does it by basically doing an impromptu boating lesson in the hospital. He helps the guy with the real version of the disease that the guy in Chocolate with Nuts was making up be able to walk and run again, even though it's backwards and even though SpongeBob runs him over later. And even though he does perform some pretty weird body modifications on Squidward without his consent, in the end, Squidward is happy with the result, even though he loses all of his limbs in the process. It's chaotic and dark enough for it to be funny, but yet not too dark so as to be unpleasant, or make it seem like SpongeBob is actively being malicious. The episode strikes a great balance, and it's actually quite fun to see SpongeBob's weird solutions and him trying to perform surgery with a spatula. They get a lot of really fun gags out of that. It's different, it's not too dark, it's funny, it's fun, it's a good episode. Also, fun fact, Squilliam cameos as a nose in this episode. So for all you Squilliam fans out there, I guess they haven't completely forgotten about him. Episode 207A. Mimic Madness. SpongeBob loses his identity after becoming addicted to mimicry. This episode is awful. And those were my impressions of the French narrator and Squidward. I hope you enjoyed them because I'm not doing the rest of the review like that. Don't be silly. Anyway, people cite Mimic Madness as the standout episode of Season 10. And for good reason, this episode is truly fantastic. First and foremost, this episode fully utilizes the talent that the show has behind it. I'm of course talking about Tom Kenny and the fact that he can do many, many amazing voices. I don't think this episode would have been nearly as great as it is if it didn't have Tom Kenny doing the mimicking. A weaker show would have had the voice actors for Sandy be speaking for SpongeBob's imitation of Sandy, and the voice actor for Squidward voicing SpongeBob's impression of Squidward, etc., etc. But this show didn't have to do that because Tom Kenny is just that talented. And part of the fun of the episode is just hearing his awesome impressions. In fact, I wonder if this episode was a test for Nickelodeon to see if anyone would notice if they replaced the entire voice cast with just Tom Kenny. But seriously, that aspect of the episode just makes it all the more fun. And in terms of comedy, there's some good gags in here. The guy yelling at the kids to eat their patties, Patrick's deranged animation when he does the SpongeBob laugh, and SpongeBob saying that he's a freak while imitating Plankton, causing him to go, "Hey," are all things that made me laugh in this episode. And then let's talk about the story. I have negatively responded to SpongeBob trying to be dramatic in the past. I think that generally that is not one of the strong suits of the show. But I have to say that this episode very much pulled off the drama perfectly. It was the right amount of taking the story seriously while also still having gags and not feeling like it was being too dramatic, or more dramatic than it had any right to be. But I do genuinely feel bad for poor SpongeBob and am very much invested in the story and want things to be okay, but yet it does not overstep its bounds as a silly comedy show. It's also another one of those episodes where most of the cast comes together to help SpongeBob. It's very rare that most of the main characters are on the same page trying to achieve a singular goal. So to see almost the full main cast there and ready to help, including Plankton, Plankton is always a very pleasant thing to see. And even though Gary is left out, he is still impersonated in the episode, so it's not like he's completely missing. And I love the way that this problem is solved. I love seeing the other characters try to imitate SpongeBob. And it's kind of funny that Tom Kenny is really good at impersonating everyone else, while everyone else kind of struggles to do the SpongeBob voice and laugh. Oh, and the song is great. It has great visuals to go along with it. It's a great tune in and of itself, and it definitely sells the dramatic part of the episode. And I mean, you could compare this to any number of other episodes that have kind of similar ideas going on. Face Freeze is not too different an episode from this one in terms of structure and story, but this episode has a lot more going for it. And there's plenty of other episodes where SpongeBob loses his identity, but surprisingly enough, I think that this might be the most powerful version of that tale. Seeing a character that is so iconic for certain traits, but yet very different in different episodes, struggle with his identity kind of feels natural in a very meta way. I know this review may not have been the most original and might end up mimicking a lot of other people's opinions out there, but it's just bound to happen when you have an episode this great. It's certainly a good episode. Fun fact, Bubble Stand is referenced when SpongeBob brings it around town for the first time in 18 years. And much like some other episodes, this one definitely goes into overload when it comes to referencing characters' catchphrases. SpongeBob and everyone else says, "I'm ready." SpongeBob's imitation of Plankton includes an "I went to college." SpongeBob says, "Good morning, Gary." Mr. Krabs says, "I've seen it before." And then there's the "bring it around town." If they could find enough material to make this a 22-minute long episode, this could have been a really fantastic way to end the entire series. Because in a way, it does kind of feel like a swan song for SpongeBob. 207B. Housewarming. SpongeBob becomes infested with worms. This episode is jellyfish jam. SpongeBob is okay with one of these animals staying with him, and then a bunch of them move in, play music, get him kicked out of his house, bother Squidward, etc., etc. It's just jellyfish jam again. And I'll be honest, jellyfish jam is already not the best episode. It's also very similar to Sanctuary as well. Additionally, I don't like any of the jokes in this one. Nothing about it screams memorable or interesting. The worms are kind of annoying in the sounds they make, and it's pretty unpleasant to see all of them popping out of SpongeBob, especially when they form his eyes and mouth. I like the way SpongeBob says whoop poo, and how the narrator also has to say whoop poo, and Squidward's line about there being no hugs, but like that's it. I really don't like this episode. And SpongeBob's laughter being the reason that the worms leave is a really weak and sudden ending. It's definitely a
ScumBob episode.
Not only is this just a shameless ripoff, but they couldn't even make it to the full 11 minutes with this story, and instead had to add a little short starring this obnoxious worm that we just saw ruin SpongeBob's life. I find it really boring. I don't really want to root for this character who just made SpongeBob's life miserable, and it's not funny, especially if you compare it to the other short in which characters do not speak. Reef Blower just blows this one right out of the water in terms of visual storytelling. The main part of this episode is a boring, gross ripoff, and the side short is just dull. And I find it an insult that this episode has to be paired with Mimic Madness. Episode 208A. Snooze You Lose. SpongeBob and Patrick pilot a sleeping Squidward so he won't miss his audition. Fun fact, J.K. Simmons guest stars as Maestro Mackerel, in a role that I think is completely wasted. They don't do anything with this character. So this episode is forgettable. We've seen SpongeBob and Patrick inside Squidward before. We've seen a giant Squidward before. We've seen characters have insomnia before. It's like a weird inverse version of slimy dancing. But Squidward piloting around SpongeBob is a lot less creepy than the way Patrick and SpongeBob crawl up inside Squidward here. It's definitely uncomfortable. And comedy-wise, this episode is a dead end. I laughed at the lady exploding randomly after Squidward bumps her, but that's about it. I don't really find Squidward's body awkwardly stumbling around to be funny. I didn't find the freakish lab Squidward to be funny, and none of the other jokes are really notable. The ending of this one is just obvious. Of course, SpongeBob is going to play the clarinet beautifully, or at least manipulate Squidward's brain into playing it beautifully, and then of course Squidward is going to wake up and play it awfully. At this point, it's happened so many times, it's just so obvious. This is a
ScumBob episode.
And it's funny that Snooze is in the title because it's definitely what I want to do while this episode is playing. The story is predictable, the comedy isn't there, and I've seen this all before. 208B. Krusty Katering. SpongeBob, Patrick, Squidward, and Mr. Krabs cater a fancy party. Firstly, I really love the idea of these characters catering a party. I feel like that framing device is a good one to put these characters in different situations. I doubt that they'll do this, but it would be pretty cool to see Krusty Katering appear in several other episodes as a means to set up some interesting stories. Nextly, I enjoy the structure of this episode. It's kind of like Drive-Thru in that it really doesn't have too much of an overarching narrative as much as it has just a bunch of little stories with each of the characters interacting with these kids at the kids party and then these fancy people at the fancy party. And along those same lines, I don't think that there's really that many big laughs in this episode, but there's a lot of little things that I very much enjoyed and giggled at. Some of SpongeBob's faces when Mr. Krabs is squishing him with his claw, that one kid's weird obsession with calling Mr. Krabs his dad, Squidward's eyeballs appearing on the lady when he smushes the tray in her face. Oh, and the part at the beginning where the characters are being tormented by the kids party is also very fun. It would have been great if this episode did have big laughs, but I think some of those quieter, kind of funny moments paired with what is ultimately a very pleasant and enjoyable episode to watch makes this a good episode. There's nothing frustrating or boring going on here. Sure, the kids at the beginning are a little loud, but it's kept within a reasonable limit. And sure, Patrick freaks out, but SpongeBob calls him on it. Their characters all cause trouble in their own unique ways, but there's just something so earnest about how they're really just chasing whatever they believe in. Squidward really wants to play his clarinet with this fancy band. Mr. Krabs definitely wants the money, but he's not trying to just steal it. He is actually trying with this catering thing. SpongeBob's just doing what he's told and trying to make the best of things. And Patrick, of course, gives into his animalistic urges. This is not the first time we've seen these characters hobnobbing with rich, fancy people, but I think that the catering angle makes it unique and fresh. And I have to say, of all those times, this is probably my favorite. Oh, and the kid with the cleats bouncing on SpongeBob is definitely payback for the Strangler. Fun fact, Mr. Krabs' giant check is dated 10/16, which is presumably some date during production. It's also great how this episode builds. As it goes further on, more and more bad things happen, leading to this wild, explosive finale. It's not the flashiest episode, it's not the funniest episode, but it's one I enjoy for the subtle things, and for not being frustrating or annoying in pretty much any way. Although this episode does make me wonder, what happened to the original caterers? I guess I would say there is somewhat of a missed opportunity here in that they start off with the kids party and then they move up to the fancy people party. It would have been interesting to have some sort of parallel between the way the kids behaved and the way the snooty rich people behaved. The episode's fine without it, but I do think that would have added a little interesting extra layer. 209A, SpongeBob's Place. Mr. Krabs gets jealous when everyone gives SpongeBob credit for the Krusty Krab success. This episode is basically just patty hype again, mixed with Bummer Vacation, the Krusty Sponge, and Band in Bikini Bottom. We've seen SpongeBob open a restaurant at his house. We've seen Mr. Krabs realize that SpongeBob is the key to success at the Krusty Krab. We've seen SpongeBob playing Krusty Krab when he's not allowed to be at the Krusty Krab. And this episode does nothing at all to make itself stand out or have its own identity separate from these episodes. Story-wise, it is the same tired thing that I am so sick of seeing. SpongeBob leaves the Krusty Krab, and the restaurant goes up in smoke. Literally, and literally pretty much every time they do this. I'm just so sick of it because you know what's gonna happen. Every single time SpongeBob gets kicked out, it's just the same thing over and over again. And this story is so strapped for ideas that the conflict of the episode ends, but yet it keeps going. Yes, when Mr. Krabs makes up with SpongeBob and realizes that he does need him, the episode keeps going on. We have to see SpongeBob's place get shut down. We have to see them go back to the Krusty Krab. We have to see this scene of Squidward singing that has nothing to do with anything, and we have to see a scene where Mr. Krabs says that SpongeBob's name is on the sign, which admittedly would have been a cute epilogue to the story in and of itself, but when you have a few other scenes in there that are completely superfluous and then that, it just feels like there's a good few minutes of filler in this episode that is basically a less interesting version of Patty Hype while ripping off a bunch of other episodes at the same time. The idea of Mr. Krabs being jealous that SpongeBob is basically the key to success at the Krusty Krab is an interesting idea, but choosing to have him send SpongeBob away and running the restaurant completely poorly is just, it's so played out. They could have had Mr. Krabs have some measure of success and basically make him compete with SpongeBob. Maybe they could have had Plankton come in to try to wedge SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs further apart so as to ruin the business. Why not have this be one of the episodes where SpongeBob actually has an ego, which he does have in some episodes, and maybe SpongeBob is cocky and thinks that he doesn't need Mr. Krabs, but the episode is about how Mr. Krabs actually does a good job at running the business. There's ideas that could have sprang off of that initial premise of Mr. Krabs being jealous of SpongeBob's success that could have been really good and interesting and different, but instead they fall back on the same old cliches, and I am sick of it. It's a
ScumBob episode.
Comedically, I will admit I did like the guy at the beginning that's being overly dramatic, saying that he could die for one of these patties, but otherwise there's nothing funny in here. The show's been going on for 10 seasons, and yes, some ideas are going to get recycled. That doesn't automatically make an episode bad, but when you have this episode that takes the great episode that is patty hype, distills it, adds in just a bunch of elements stolen from other places, doesn't have its own comedy or style or anything interesting going for it, I have no slack to be cut here. And I'll tell you where SpongeBob's place is. SpongeBob's place is at the bottom of the ocean with the rest of the ScumBob episodes. 209B, Plankton gets the boot. After he insults her, Karen kicks Plankton out. Okay, so as far as characters on this show go, I like Plankton. I like Plankton a lot. I think he's actually the most consistently well-written, interesting, and funny character on the show. I like Karen as well. I think she's a rare element that really blossomed in the post-first movie era. She adds an interesting dynamic to Plankton, and she can be an interesting character in her own right. And I like Karen and Plankton together. Not really as a couple, so much as I just like their banter and back and forth. They're equally snarky, and Karen very frequently does not put up with Plankton's huge ego. She's a good character for him to bounce off of and sometimes assist in his plans. But almost every time they do one of these episodes that's about their relationship, it suffers in the same predictable ways. Every time one leaves the other, we know they're gonna get back together at the end of the episode. And it pretty much always feels like Plankton doesn't actually genuinely care about her. He's always using her to get the patty formula, or seems to be interested in her just because she's there. In this episode, though Plankton does say that she's the most conniving person he's ever met and seems to show interest in her, his main goal seems to be getting back into the chum bucket. Because even though they've done this sort of thing a few times now, we've never really had an episode where I personally felt like Plankton actually genuinely really liked Karen and wanted to treat her better. Plankton always goes back to treating Karen awfully at the end of the episode. And much like in SpongeBob's place, I don't really see this episode actually adding anything new to that formula. Say what you want about previous attempts, at least Karen 2.0 actually had the new robot to stand out in that episode. And Single Cell Anniversary had the sweet song. But what does this have? SpongeBob dressing up as a girl robot pretending to go on a date with Plankton? He's done something like that in Love That Squid. And the whole reforming Plankton thing could have been really funny and interesting, but the jokes there just aren't very good. And ultimately, it seems like a much, much inferior version of Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 3. And of course, primarily this episode feels like a rehash of Single Cell Anniversary, which is an episode that I wasn't even a huge fan of. I already gave you the spiel in SpongeBob's place about rehashing ideas, so I won't say it again. It's a
ScumBob episode.
I can understand why someone might like this more than me if they're more forgiving on rehash ideas, but personally, I never really thought that this formula worked very well in the first place. If you're gonna go this route, at least make Plankton actually sweet in the end. Sure, it would have been a rehash, but at least it could have been a happy ending. But this episode doesn't even have that. Oh, and fun fact, Karen's new screensaver actually references the classic screensaver Flying Toasters. Look it up, kids. If there is one singular thing that I can say positively about this episode, it's the continuity overload that happens in the background of one very quick scene. After Plankton moves in with SpongeBob, we see everything from the pizza box from Pizza Delivery to the pin the tail on the seahorse from Party Pooper Pants to eels and escalators. There's like 10 or 13 episodes referenced in total. It's great, and I love how it is literally only on screen for a few seconds. It's the perfect kind of Easter egg for fans without being distracting in the slightest. Episode 210A, Life Insurance. SpongeBob, Patrick, and Squidward believe life insurance makes them invincible. I don't actually have that much to say about this one. This episode follows in the tradition of classic SpongeBob, Patrick, and Squidward episodes, where SpongeBob and Patrick are doing something, Squidward becomes interested, and then eventually goes overboard with it. The thing that makes this one different than all the others is its heavy use in physical comedy and the set piece of the sushi maker. This is another episode that I think really looks great. Kaz always does a great job with storyboarding, and because of how well animated and designed everything is, the physical comedy here is amplified. But of course, those are not the only jokes. There's a great one where the scene suddenly cuts to a driver that's going out of control, and he just says, "Driving is hard." And it's funny, if only for how random it is. And story-wise, it does follow that classic structure. The idea that SpongeBob and Patrick think that life insurance literally makes them invincible is something that fits right within their characters and is exactly the kind of misunderstanding that they would have. It's nothing flashy, and it does follow along the lines of some really classic episodes that set a very high standard for this sort of thing, but I think that Life Insurance is a good episode. I particularly like the sequence where Squidward goes through the sushi maker. There's some great physical comedy in that. If there's one thing that I don't like, though, it's Mr. Krabs' part in the episode. It's obvious that he's gonna try to cash in on the life insurance thing, and him rooting for Squidward to die is predictable and too dark for the character. Not that it'll be the last time it happens this season. Oh, and fun fact, Fiasco makes a cameo appearance in this episode, as well as the design for SpongeBob's new boating instructor from the episode Mrs. Puff, You're Fired. It's always cool to see little cameos like that. 210B, Burst Your Bubble. SpongeBob makes his own vehicle out of bubbles. Fun fact, just like in Driven to Tears, Patrick once again has a boatmobile, although it's not the same boatmobile. One of the most talked about parts in this episode is Mr. Krabs washing his boat while wearing booty shorts and twerking. And honestly, I don't see the big deal here. It's a very, very short scene, and sure, his butt protrudes a bit, but I don't think it's anything really obscene or even really that noteworthy. I didn't find it funny, but I think people are kind of exaggerating a bit. So this is a second attempt at giving Mrs. Puff and SpongeBob a role reversal. Since Summer Job was a pretty big flop, I don't really mind them giving this concept another chance. Did this one do it well? It certainly did it better, but they don't exactly devote a lot of time to that part of the episode. On the plus side, I do like the justification for the role reversal, why SpongeBob has to teach Mrs. Puff, and overall I like the idea of SpongeBob making his own vehicle out of bubbles. It feels like a fun, interesting idea, and it provides some decent visual gags of the bubbles bouncing against each other, Mrs. Puff puffing up in one of the bubbles, and other things like that. That being said, I don't think the episode is very funny, and I do wish that there was maybe more time with SpongeBob teaching Mrs. Puff, as that feels to really be the meat of the episode. I could have done with less scenes of SpongeBob blowing bubble cars for the rest of Bikini Bottom, as not much actually happens in there in terms of story or comedy. All they needed really was just a brief scene showing people demanding these boats and SpongeBob making a bunch of them. Similarly, I would have liked to have been given a reason why Mrs. Puff is not good at piloting these bubbles. I guess the idea is just that because she's so good at driving a traditional boat, she can't adapt to the difference, but it would have been interesting to see them give like a real tangible reason, like maybe her spines pop the bubble cars very easily. It's also interesting that this has "you don't need a license to drive a bubble," which obviously seems to have been inspired by one of the most famous lines from the first SpongeBob movie. All that said, it's a meh episode. I just don't think they pushed the SpongeBob teaching Mrs. Puff thing far enough. There were definitely places where I feel like they could have inserted a lot more jokes, but this one is just a very joke-light episode. It's got some good ideas in it, but as a whole, I can't really call it good. Episode 211A, Plankton Retires. After a series of failures, Plankton fakes his retirement. The idea of having basically a compilation of a bunch of different Plankton attempts to get the formula is an idea that I love. It's an idea that I love so much that I even proposed this sort of episode back in my nice try video. Granted, I made that video after this episode came out, but I swear I did not see this episode. It just so happened to be a pretty awesome coincidence. And as much as I love the idea of it and that they went through with that, I have to say the execution is kind of flawed. Outside of the very first plan, they go through the rest of them so fast, and the rest of them don't really have good jokes either. So as in love as I am with this idea, and I'm happy that they at least tried it, I really don't think they did a great job with it. Though I do enjoy Plankton's first plan. How he has this mechanical seahorse for literally no reason. He just rides it over to the front door of the Krusty Krab and then gets off it. But this montage of Plankton failures only takes up about 4 minutes in the episode. The rest of it is, I hate to say this, but it is just new leaf, again, and worse. Yes, they do the fake out of Plankton retiring. And they do it in such a half-hearted, weak way. Plankton goes to a retirement home, Krabs and SpongeBob follow, but oh no, it turns out that they're all robots, and Plankton was really trying to steal the formula all along, but SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs are ahead of him. Not only is the main chunk of this episode shortened because of that intro montage, but the end of the episode is padded as well. After we see that they're all robots, we cut back to the Krusty Krab, and then we have a scene of them all fighting over the formula, SpongeBob wondering what happened to the robot duplicates, and then we see the robot duplicates having a good time. I mean, look, I might have my problems with New Leaf, but I will give that episode the credit that at least it committed to the idea of Plankton retiring. This one does attempt to fool the audience, but they don't even bother. On the positive side of things, there is one joke that I do really like, where SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs' old people costumes fall to the ground, and passerbys see what looks like beheaded old people and freak out. Fun fact, the Krusty Katering truck actually makes a reappearance in this episode. It's too bad that it looks completely different. So, in a way I got my wish, but it's not like it really actually matters in terms of the episode, and they couldn't even get the design right. It's another
ScumBob episode.
I just cannot stand that they did this idea again. It's already frustrating enough that they tried to fool the audience the first time, but this time, it just feels like a really poor man's version of that. I can't overlook how stupid it is that they just recycled this plot, and how a lot of parts in it just feel fillery. Episode 211B, Trident Trouble. SpongeBob accidentally swaps his spatula with Neptune's trident. So, the big thing with this episode is that it uses a version of the narrative device known as a Greek chorus. Basically, in ancient plays, the Greek chorus served as a way to basically tell the audience certain things. It consisted of a number of different players who essentially offered up commentary on what was happening in the story. Think of them as somewhere between a narrator and a laugh track in terms of modern television. Anyway, without getting too book reporty on you, I really like SpongeBob's take on the Greek chorus. How basically they exist to tell us how stupid SpongeBob is and how ridiculous the mistakes he's making are. They don't actually interact with the story or affect it in any way, but their presence is interesting, different, and provides some good laughs. It's also very cathartic to hear characters in the show actually acknowledge how stupid the characters can be sometimes. But aside from that, the episode also has this weird Sorcerer's Apprentice vibe going on, when SpongeBob summons all the patties. Having the music be all whimsical, it's a nice little tribute. And the base concept here is actually a really clever one. Having the spatula and the trident be swapped for each other, they look just similar enough for that switch to make sense. And I love seeing Neptune triumphantly present the spatula as he's about to begin a fight. The whole thing is just a great story with a great narrative device, some good laughs in there, and it's a very memorable episode because of the Greek chorus and the trident. It's a good episode. Oh, and dear God, is this episode so much better than the Clash of Triton, especially in King Neptune's character. From his inception, he was always kind of a cocky jerk, but the Clash of Triton really turned him into a complete unlikable monster who intentionally makes his subjects' lives miserable. We don't really get to see too much of him in this episode, but he definitely comes off as a lot more likable here. Episode 212A, The Incredible Shrinking Sponge. After a freak accident, SpongeBob ends up tiny. So I can definitely say this episode gets a lot of mileage out of its premise. Small SpongeBob fights with an urchin, gets grabbed by some kids, gets to be measured and compared to Plankton, tries to do his job, and becomes a personal hygiene assistant. It's not a boring episode because stuff is constantly happening. I like the fact that SpongeBob ends up squishing Plankton even though he's technically smaller than him. And like that, there's situations that are like comical, but none of the jokes really stood out to me. I can't even think of a single one after having just watched the episode. And to add to the negatives, yes, this episode is another episode where characters get shrunk. We've seen it before in Squidtastic Voyage, Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 4, and we've seen plenty of things from the perspective of a small character with Plankton, the episode and the character. I wouldn't say the episode is too similar to any other, but it does kind of share a main memorable gimmick with these episodes. So although I don't think it's a ripoff, it really doesn't dazzle me with its premise. And although a lot happens in it, it's not like the story here is anything to write home about. Though, as another point on the plus side, even though we've had a lot of other characters and scenes from a small person's perspective, I actually really like how this episode goes about portraying that, particularly in the back of the Krusty Krab, where we go under the grill and we see the condiments close up. They do a really great job at showing the detail in these objects that are ordinarily so small on the screen, but now are giant because of SpongeBob's perspective. But as another point against it, I have to say that the close-up shots of the gross people that need personal hygiene are gross. They're not like exceedingly gross, but I still could have done without seeing that. Oh, and this episode also has an urchin in the Krusty Krab, which also happened in Eek and Urchin. Although, weirdly, SpongeBob is really friendly to the urchin this time. It definitely makes sense that SpongeBob would be friendly to all creatures great and small, but it is a little odd considering how he treated them in their last major appearance. It's not a huge deal, but it is a little annoying that the episode borrows that aspect again and doesn't really do too much with it, while directly contradicting. So, I don't know, it all balances out to about a meh. On the surface, it's a fun enough episode, but the idea has been done before, the comedy isn't there, and the whole thing ends up being kind of forgettable. Also, in this episode, SpongeBob's problem is solved with bubbles and absorption. 212B. Sportz? Squidward tricks SpongeBob and Patrick into hurting themselves by playing sports. So first off, I have to say that even for a show as silly and weird as SpongeBob is, SpongeBob and Patrick not knowing what sports are is an idea that's kind of out there. I mean, they've played plenty of sports, like, well, there was the football episode. They play mini golf in a friendly game. And they at least know what extreme sports are, or extreme spots. They reference football in Don't Look Now, and yeah, sure, you could use the excuse that this episode took place before all of them, but really it's just a silly way to lead into this episode. I just kind of find the choice to be a little bit head-scratching. Though there has been a few episodes about extreme sports, sports in general is a subject that isn't covered very often on SpongeBob, so I do give this episode credit for actually delving into one of the topics that hasn't been done to death, and I do like the ridiculous mashups of sports that are featured in this episode. It's creative. And as I have to say all too often, it's not a very funny episode. But it's not dead on humor, at least. I was amused by SpongeBob and Patrick's ankles swelling after running on ice skates and them throwing horseshoes at each other. Honestly, what holds this episode together is the memorable set piece of this big sports stadium and all of the wacky sports that Squidward, SpongeBob, Sandy, and Patrick play. And yeah, it's entertaining. It won't be winning any first place trophies, but Sportz is a good episode. It's not a very good episode, and it almost got a meh, but hey, the visual gags are amusing at the very least, and I do like the story in this one. Squidward has facilitated for SpongeBob and Patrick to indirectly hurt themselves on a number of occasions, and this time, though he ends up succeeding, he definitely gets what he deserves in the end, and it's cathartic to see Sandy kick his butt. And I do get a kick out of the guy saying that they are sports fans, they do not participate. Fun fact, the Wilhelm scream can actually be heard in this episode, which is a first for SpongeBob, as far as I'm aware. Episode 213A. The Getaway. SpongeBob unwittingly becomes the getaway driver for a notorious criminal. So, weirdly enough, this is the second time this season where I had an idea for an episode that ends up kind of actually happening. Although this time I made my video before this episode even aired. Granted, my idea was to have Mrs. Puff be Plankton's getaway driver, which I still think is a more interesting idea, but I guess it is just kind of a natural conclusion when you have a character who's a boating instructor who is related to crime. Eventually, they'd go with some sort of plot involving a getaway driver. I should also note that, for whatever reason, it seems like all of the boating school episodes in seasons 9 and 10 have SpongeBob driving out on a major road. I mean, it definitely looks visually good to have SpongeBob interacting with a bunch of other boats on the road, and it has the benefit of including a lot of good action in these episodes, but man, whatever happened to Mrs. Puff's actual boating school? It's seen a little bit in Bubble Troubles, but I feel like that aspect of the show has just kind of disappeared. Anyway, the entire thing is a chase between SpongeBob and this criminal, and Mrs. Puff and what was supposed to be the criminal's getaway driver. There's nothing strange or bad about the story, it's just pretty straightforward. The criminal has SpongeBob stop along the way so he can steal a bunch of things, and Mrs. Puff tells the getaway driver to chase him down. And Mrs. Puff doesn't even end up in jail at the end of the episode. Well, I mean, technically she is within the jail's perimeter, but she is not in jail, although she's also begging to be put in jail. What I'm trying to get at here is just that nothing that bad really happens to Mrs. Puff other rather than continuing to be stuck with SpongeBob as a student. And that's definitely refreshing. And joke-wise, there's quite a few kind of clever, chuckle-worthy gags. SpongeBob's tail, which is a ponytail, the visual gag of his wacky face on the learner's permit photo, SpongeBob driving like a crazy maniac, and what he does for abstract thinking. None of these jokes are hugely funny, but it definitely has its comedic moments. And the whole episode takes place at night, which is also something that's kind of rare for the show. So the whole episode has this slightly different vibe to it because it is just this one long chase throughout Bikini Bottom in the dark. It's also interesting that they do cut back to Mrs. Puff with the getaway driver, where she appreciates his driving and starts to develop somewhat of a crush on him. Granted, it's kind of weird that they decided to do this in the one season in which Mrs. Puff and Mr. Krabs are actually continually dating, because them dating is brought up in the very first episode of the season, and spoilers, but it's also brought up in the second to last episode of the season. But although the timing of it is kind of weird, it is interesting to see Mrs. Puff actually have romantic feelings for this random one-off character. Gives her something cool to do in the episode aside from just chase SpongeBob down. The episode also has a few brief Easter eggs, like Smitty Worman Yigerman Jensen's #1 gravestone in the background at the beginning of the episode, and that the coral that hits the prisoner spells out Kaz with an exclamation point at the end. Who co-wrote this episode? I will say, though, that this story could maybe be a little bit more interesting, like maybe they add some sort of wrinkle in the middle, because ultimately it's just super straightforward. SpongeBob accidentally becomes a getaway driver for this criminal who he thinks is his new teacher. SpongeBob unwittingly helps him commit a bunch of crimes. Then SpongeBob gets him hurt a bunch, which makes him beg to go back to jail. The end. It's just all a little basic, and when you get right down to it, it does sound very similar to one of my favorite episodes of the entire series, SpongeBob Meets the Strangler. You'll also notice that there is an element of this episode that I haven't really spoken about yet, and that is the main criminal, Sticky Fins. And the reason why I haven't really brought him up much is that I think he's the worst aspect of this episode. This character is utterly forgettable. He's a criminal, and that's it. The stuff that I find funny about this episode isn't even really about him. His design is kind of boring, his characteristics are just kind of boring, and he's not anywhere near as fun or crazy and deranged as the Tattletale Strangler. This show has had some great and memorable one-off characters, and Sticky Fins is definitely not one of them. So although I do like the main premise of this episode, and I do think that it has some chuckle-worthy moments and an interesting atmosphere, when you get right down to it, it is a poor man's SpongeBob Meets the Strangler. So it's meh. It's a bit of a forgettable episode, but it's not one that's hard to get through. Episode 213B, Lost and Found. SpongeBob takes a journey into the maze that is the Krusty Krab's Lost and Found. So the main thing that I like about this episode is the Lost and Found itself. It's visually striking, being this dark space with endless rows of shelves. And speaking of those shelves, they do contain a lot of references to older episodes. And the show does have some fun playing around with all these random items being down here. That being said, I don't feel like the episode pushes it far enough. SpongeBob dancing on the whoopee cushions is okay, but I wanted more silliness like that, where SpongeBob plays around with items on the shelves. There are some really great lost puns towards the end during the chase scene, but other than that, I really don't feel like the episode utilizes the space that it has. And the space itself isn't even a totally original thing. Welcome to the Bikini Bottom Triangle is another episode where SpongeBob gets lost amongst a pile of junk. But what really drags this episode down, in my opinion, is the story. We keep cutting back to this kid crying, which we've already established that he's upset in the beginning. We don't need to keep going back to him. I understand the show is trying to make a ticking clock with how the kid's crying is driving away people from the Krusty Krab, but this episode really isn't that high stakes to begin with, and cutting back to the crying is just annoying. We know he's upset, we know he's driving away the customers, just keep the focus on SpongeBob being lost in this interesting location. But an even bigger issue than that is the whole lost children concept of this episode, where SpongeBob runs into a bunch of elderly people that were apparently kids that got lost in the Krusty Krab. The episode could have had a monster be the antagonist, or had SpongeBob being lost been the main conflict all on its own. But for whatever reason, they decided to have these elderly people who literally lost their entire childhood and adulthoods to the Krusty Krab's weird basement lost and found. These characters aren't interesting or funny on their own, so nothing distracts me from how depressing this concept is. Yeah, it's SpongeBob, and yeah, it wasn't supposed to be taken as dark, but gosh darn it, it is dark. Yeah, okay, you can play it off at the end like they have a touching reunion, but most of these people's lives are just completely gone, and their family coming to the Krusty Krab every week is way more stupid than it is funny. And on top of that, I think that the Easter eggs in this episode are actually not handled very well. First of all, some of the things on the shelves are from the SpongeBob movie, which is supposed to take place after the series. It's not like this is a huge deal, but if you're going to give us a continuity nod, you might want to actually remember the show's continuity. But worse than that, I couldn't really focus as much on the episode itself the first time I watched it because I had my eyes kept on the shelves scanning them for more references to the show. For the most part, it's kept to just kind of one shelving unit that has all of these references, but there's the soda drink hat on another one, and I'm not convinced that there aren't other references in other places that I just haven't seen yet. The continuity nod moment in Plankton Gets the Boot is great because it's just that one moment where you can pause it and enjoy all of the little continuity bits, but here I'm more distracted in trying to look for little references than I am with paying attention to the actual episode, so I do think it actually takes something away, which is pretty rare. Though there are some small compliments I have for this episode, like the chase scene being okay, the ladder gag being decent, and the Lost World pun actually being funny. Ultimately, it is a
ScumBob episode.
I just end up being distracted during it. Instead of thinking about the actual story, I'm thinking about these unfortunate implications and scanning the background for Easter eggs. The actual story itself just does not hold my attention. Episode 214A, Patrick's Coupon. Patrick goes to great lengths to redeem his coupon for free ice cream. Fun fact, Peter Braungart guest stars as the Ice Cream King. You know, the guy who looks like Patrick's uncle, or grandpa, or something. When I first watched this episode, I really wasn't sure what to think about it. It is a little bit all over the place in that it starts out with Patrick fighting a sea spider, and then he finds a coupon, which then he has to keep from Mr. Krabs trying to take it, and he thinks a bunch of citizens are going to take it, so he has to guard it from them. He goes to get his free ice cream, but then he finds out that his coupon is expired. He has to fight the Ice Cream King to get it redeemed, and then when he does, it turns out that it melted. It's not like the episode is strictly just about Patrick trying to keep his coupon away from prying hands, or that it's just about him fighting the Ice Cream King. There's a lot that goes on in here, and while in some other episodes a lack of focus like this would be a negative, I actually think it works in this episode's favor. Since it is a Patrick episode, it does kind of make sense that the focus is a little bit all over the place. But it is still technically all about Patrick wanting to get ice cream for SpongeBob, which is a noble endeavor. And while yes, Patrick did slap an ice cream cone out of SpongeBob's hand because he wanted to be such a nice guy and get him an ice cream cone, overall Patrick does come off as pretty heroic in this episode. And I think that's really sweet. Having Patrick want to do something selfless for SpongeBob as the main motivation for his actions in this episode make Patrick a lot more noble and likable than he would be in several others. Thematically, it kind of reminds me a little bit of the Donut of Shame, although they have very little else in common. This is a random observation, but the ice cream store in this episode definitely looks like the goofy goober that we see in SpongeBob the movie, the video game. I can't be the only one that thinks that, right? So although the story is a little bit unfocused, it does still work for Patrick, and it does still feature a pretty natural progression. And for once, Patrick freaking out over something is actually justified. Sure, the random townspeople of Bikini Bottom aren't trying to steal his coupon, but that paranoia was born out of a character who actually was legitimately trying to steal his coupon. And because that's only one part of the episode instead of being the entirety of what the episode is about, I think Patrick's ignorance works pretty well and doesn't stretch on for too long. I also really like Patrick's interactions with the Ice Cream King, and I like how though he is an antagonist, he's not like evil or mean or anything. He just seems like an eccentric guy that wants Patrick to prove himself before just giving away free ice cream. And it's actually pretty rare that we see a character on the show that can match Patrick's weirdness and special line of thinking. So it was pretty cool to see him interact with that character. As far as jokes, I really love the one where the guy tells the guy insulting Patrick to bump up the insults a little more after seeing how pathetic Patrick was, despite coming in to defend him in the first place. And I like how Patrick brought SpongeBob the handshake at the end. We never see him taking Krabs' arm, but presumably he just ripped it off him. How random that is just kind of makes me chuckle. There's also a self-deprecating line about how people don't respect cartoons, with the fish walking by the Bikini Bottom Walk of Fame. I'm not in love with this episode or anything, but I do think that it is different, and it is another episode where Patrick is the protagonist, and it does genuinely work. I think it's a good episode. Is it another no hat for Pat? Certainly not. but there's a few funny moments. Patrick has a great motivation, there's some nice variety in the episode, an interesting new character that can match wits with Patrick, and so it's overall enjoyable. And unlike some of the other stuff in this season, pretty original. Episode 214B, Out of the Picture. Mr. Krabs tries to get rid of Squidward to raise the value of his newly purchased art. Ooh boy, finally, we got something nice and controversial to talk about. Yes, this is an episode where Mr. Krabs tries to explicitly murder Squidward just for money. But what makes this episode so interesting, I think, is that even though that alone is a pretty off-putting premise, this episode is one of, if not the most funny episode in the season. And I know that's not saying a ton because even the episodes I liked this season weren't exactly packed with jokes. But seriously, the gags at the beginning of Squidward showing people his art and then bursting into flames and running away, they are all just really well done. The execution of these jokes is so funny. The timing of people's reactions, how everyone else reacts to the characters getting set on fire and running away and screaming horribly is just golden. It is beautiful and funny, and that's just the very beginning of the episode. We also have Mr. Krabs' laugh where he goes art, 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 because he just purchased some art. SpongeBob telling Mr. Krabs not to be menial to Squidward, Squidward's traumatized face after he gets beamed down by the Martians, and even just how ridiculous some of the paintings that Squidward painted of himself look in the episode are funny. There's a lot of good gags here, and the whole episode is just really good at selling these jokes. On top of that, we get to see various weird locations in this episode, which range from Mars to Rock Bottom. Literally the first time we've seen Rock Bottom since Rock Bottom. Granted, I wish they did a little bit more with it, but still, it's cool that it's here and SpongeBob remembers Rock Bottom and he remembers the people he met down there. Oh, and speaking of little continuity nods, I don't know if this is intentional or not, but fun fact, Squidward was screaming about Martians in the very first episode of this season, and now he gets to see Martians. And it's also the second time this season that Squidward got blasted off in a rocket ship against his will. It's funny, it's interesting, it's got continuity nods, it's got variety in locations, and it's got great art on Squidward's pictures. But it is still an episode about Mr. Krabs trying to murder Squidward. And if you're thinking that I'm exaggerating here, well, the episode actually has a good excuse at first, in that Mr. Krabs is trying to get Squidward out of the picture. He is trying to send him off to far-off locations to get him lost, to make it seem like he's dead, even though Mr. Krabs isn't trying to kill him necessarily. And I think that justification, that premise, that idea works because it's not quite as dark as Mr. Krabs trying to kill him, but towards the end of the episode, Mr. Krabs whips out a mallet and is literally trying to kill Squidward. I just wish they tweaked the episode a little bit so that it was never about murder and was only about Mr. Krabs trying to send Squidward off. Maybe instead of having Mars be earlier in the episode, maybe the ending could have been Mr. Krabs trying to trap Squidward in a box to send him off to Mars or something like that. I just feel like it is too dark for the character, even if he is a fun and interesting antagonist for the rest of the episode. But all that being said, of course, I think this is a good episode. If you've paid attention to my reviews over the years, you'll know that I do value comedy quite a bit. And this episode being as funny as it is means a lot more to me than how dark a part of it is. Yes, I wish Mr. Krabs hadn't have done that. Yes, I understand why that is a huge turnoff for a lot of people and why they might not like this episode. But I've seen a whole season of pretty mediocre SpongeBob comedy, so to see an episode that comedically at least could have fit in with the earlier seasons, it just brings me so much joy and makes me so happy to see. And although I do like the ending of the episode, like the bit where Mr. Krabs and Squidward destroy Squidward's paintings and that is deemed as performance art, which is artistically viable but of course doesn't deserve a penny of actual money, I think that whole sequence was well done and it does make for a neat climax with a funny punchline. I think the very ending where Mr. Krabs and Squidward become the art is pretty lame. Mostly because Squidward didn't do anything wrong in this episode. He doesn't deserve to be punished at the end. If it was just Mr. Krabs being turned into the art, that I could understand and that is an ending that I would have supported. But Squidward, he just really didn't deserve it. The rest of the episode is on Squidward's side. Although he gets hurt a little bit, he still gets to return back to the Krusty Krab and he still gets to be smug and happy that he is now validated as an artist. So yeah, disregarding the last 2 or 3 minutes of this episode, I think that everything else is just great. Oh, and I also love the theme of the episode. The idea that money and art have this weird relationship where sometimes they go together really well and sometimes they're at odds with each other. This is a topic that the show has explored before, and I'm not saying this episode goes into any deep discussion on it or anything, but I think it's a theme that totally makes sense for episodes featuring Squidward and Mr. Krabs playing off of each other. And I think it's a topic that would work well for a bunch more episodes in the future. Episode 215A, Feral Friends. Sandy must keep her friends safe when Bikini Bottom goes primitive. This episode is just, it's different. It's one of, if not like the only episode in all of SpongeBob beyond season 1 that has lore in it. Like, there's interesting things presented in this episode that make me kind of question what I know about the universe that SpongeBob resides in. Sandy knew the French narrator all this time, and he's a dude in a scuba suit that's just been monitoring everything, and he's actually a character in the show? Sure, he showed up in a gag in No Free Rides, but that's just a one-off gag. Here it's confirmed he's a character that Sandy knows. And anatomically correct, non-intelligent fish exist in this show. They're just considered the primitive form of the characters. Like, they're some sort of ancestors that they evolved from, or maybe there are actual primitive fish still out there and it's just that Bikini Bottom is civilized. The first time I watched this episode, my jaw was kind of agape. I'm not trying to claim that this like changes everything. It's not like we found out that SpongeBob was Pink Diamond or something. No, it's not some series changing twist, but I do think that it actually does have lore, and that's really interesting on its own. And having the French narrator be in it as a character was just a really big and very pleasant surprise. On top of that, the episode itself is at least mildly educational. The French narrator talks about facts related to the actual animals that SpongeBob is based on. I couldn't tell you if these facts are 100% true, but as far as I can tell, they're at least based on truth. And on top of all that, this episode has a bit more action than your average SpongeBob episode. So like Mimic Madness, I think this is another episode this season that actually gets SpongeBob drama down right. I was genuinely curious at where the story was going to go next. And Sandy does a great job at being the protagonist, something that she hardly ever gets to do. She makes smart moves and has to scramble to keep her friends safe. You get to see both her cowgirl side when she has to ride Pearl to safety, and you get to see her scientist side when she studies the now primitive creatures. And though the episode for the most part is very light on jokes, because that's really not what they're going for the bulk of it, and some of the jokes in the episode are, well, we'll get to those. There's at least one or two jokes at the beginning that made me laugh, like Squidward saying that whoever went in the bathroom before him was an animal. So with all that said, it is a good episode. Just because on a base level, it's interesting, it's different, it made me care about the characters and their situation, and it provided me with a lot of surprises. This is one of the rare cases where I was like genuinely shocked by something that happened in this show. But because unfortunately it can't all be sunshine and roses, let's talk about the bad things about this episode. First off, there's the ending. It's like the show had to go and ruin the slightly educational and action and intrigue-oriented story it had going on with the most immature, stupid jokes at the end. When all the characters come back, they're naked, which is pretty par for the course for transformation-based episodes, but the fact that we see Pearl naked, which is very uncomfortable, Patrick's giant buttocks are wrapped around Sandy's helmet when he comes back, and Mr. Krabs and Mrs. Puff had this weird flirty thing where they look at each other naked, makes that last part of the episode just really bad. And then the other major thing that I really didn't like was Patchy. Patchy is inserted into this episode basically to make it longer than 11 minutes, because even though the episode is special in a lot of ways, technically speaking, it doesn't go beyond the 11 minutes if you remove the Patchy parts. And yeah, because this episode, even with Patchy, isn't all that long, Patchy doesn't get to do anything. He doesn't have a story of his own. He doesn't even have like a mini story of his own or anything interesting going on in the wraparound segments. And those segments are edited very, very poorly. The whole thing just looks cheap. And I know a big part of Patchy's appeal was that he was supposed to be in this stylistically sucky kind of show, but the way they do these fast edits where they cut in the middle of whatever Patchy's doing, and just how cheap the boat looks on the water there, it just looks actually poorly made instead of stylistically sucking in a way that's actually funny. The only thing that Patchy actually gets to do in this episode is at the end where he turns into a caveman, which we've already seen a live-action caveman in the Patchy segments before, and where Potty thinks that he's a piece of food, which Potty already did that in the last appearance of Patchy and Potty. Like, even when something actually happens in these segments, it's just ripping off things that happened before. In an episode where the French narrator gets to be a character that's involved in the story, the fact that they couldn't come up with something better for Patchy to do during it is a really glaring mistake and just kinda sad. They threw him in here to get an extra few minutes out of it to make the episode feel more special when it just didn't need it. Though I find this a good episode, I do think that Patchy and the stupid naked stuff at the end of the actual SpongeBob segment is heavily weighing it down and keeping it pretty far off from being an amazing episode, like it totally could have been. Episode 215B, Don't Wake Patrick. SpongeBob must keep a sleepwalking Patrick out of danger. Fun fact, this is the third time a short is attached to an extra-length episode. Alright, this is the last review of the season, so I'm just gonna go ahead and cut right to the chase here. This is a meh episode. I watched this thing 3 times, and I just find it so forgettable. There's nothing technically wrong with it. The characters are all acting as they should. The story is a natural fit for SpongeBob. Nothing is annoying or frustrating or gross or weird or wrong. It's just nothing is good about it either. The funny moments aren't funny. It's just kind of a generic Patrick walks around and causes trouble storyline. Even though SpongeBob hasn't done this before, I feel like they've done this before. So I guess you could say it's almost too natural a fit for the show. And while yes, the story does take the characters to some interesting places, like the amusement park or the chum bucket, I don't feel like it plays with those environments enough. And the humor here is it's just like non-existent. I remember the joke about SpongeBob putting the spaghetti in his stomach, but I don't think it's funny. It's just your textbook middle of the road kind of forgettable episode. So this episode has the honor of being the first short that I consider to be meh. And by extension, it is technically my 10th favorite SpongeBob short. And that is every episode in SpongeBob Season 10 reviewed. So let's take a look at the charts. Because the episode number in this season is so unusual, it's definitely more beneficial to look at the percentages over the actual episode numbers. And in that respect, the season is obviously better than seasons 6 and 7. It's nowhere near as good as season 4. It's a bit better than season 8, a bit worse than season 9, and most interestingly, it's very, very close to season 5 from a statistical standpoint. Almost the same percentage of good episodes, with season 5 beating season 10 by a small margin, but season 5 has more ScumBobs than season 10. That being said, in terms of actual episode quality, I would probably prefer season 5 over season 10. 5 is just the funnier season, and there's very, very little ripping off of previous episodes. The only advantage that season 10 has is that it's shorter, so therefore easier to get through, because you'd have to sit through more ScumBob and Meh episodes in season 5. But going back to season 9, it is interesting that season 10 does seem to be a step down from season 9. If you compare it to 9A and 9B individually, 10 actually falls in between the two. It's better than 9A, but it's worse than 9B. In terms of looking at the actual episodes themselves instead of just statistics, I'm actually not sure whether I'd consider season 9 or 10 to be better. That sounds like something that could make for an interesting video later down the line. Anyway, on to the rating. It should certainly be no surprise to anyone at this point that I do consider this to be a meh season. I don't see season 10 breaking SpongeBob out of its slump. 9B was an honorable effort, but it's still technically a part of 9, so unfortunately it means we are in our 3rd season of meh territory. Though it might be true that adding more episodes into seasons 6 and 7 did hurt them, in this case, at least, reducing the episode order did not affect the season rating at all, as it does not waver from the current trend of meh seasons. Alright, now it is time for the bottom 5. At number 5, we have Plankton Retires. Number 4, Plankton Gets the Boot. Number 3, Housewarming. Number 2, SpongeBob's Place. And number 1, Whirly Brains. Aside from the worst entry on this list, all of the rest of them fall here because they are blatantly copying previous episodes. With SpongeBob's Place and Housewarming being the worst, Plankton Gets the Boot being slightly more original, and Plankton Retires, despite being a very blatant ripoff, at least having a little bit of good in it, with Plankton's first scheme in the opening montage, and a few decent jokes scattered around the episode. I gave the worst episode spot to Whirly Brains because that diaper gag is so disgusting, and it just feels like such a brain-dead episode. And now for the top 5. At number 5, we have Feral Friends, Number 4, we have Shock Out of the Picture. Number 3, Trident Trouble. Number 2, Code Yellow. And number 1, Mimic Madness, which was honestly a lock for number 1. It's clearly the best episode of the season. Code Yellow was a surprising hit, but with its mixture of classical SpongeBob shenanigans and a happy ending for pretty much everyone involved, it definitely fits into the number 2 spot. Trident Trouble was another episode that did something a little different and worked out pretty well, and Out of the Picture had to be on here because I found it the most funny out of the entire season, with the last few minutes of the episode definitely holding it lower on the list than it would have been. Similarly, Feral Friends is a really good episode in a lot of ways, but it is held back by the stupid nudity joke and the pointless Patchy segments. Alright, now onto the notes. The first note I have is just that this is a very, very weird season. Yes, we got Mrs. Puff episodes, yes, we got Plankton episodes, and yes, we got a Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episode, but we didn't get a Gary episode, we didn't get a Flying Dutchman episode, and there's only one special, and it's only 16-ish minutes. Something else interesting is that I found the Plankton episodes in Season 9 to be mostly good and the big highlight of the season, whereas in Season 10 I found both of his episodes to be rehashed awfulness. Also, the show seems to be a bit dumbed down. I feel like a lot of the more clever wordplay jokes are gone, and instead we get a bunch of wacky faces. One of the reasons why classic SpongeBob is considered so good is the sheer variety of jokes. Yes, wacky faces were a part of it, and yes, wacky faces can certainly be funny, but that cannot be the only joke you tell in an episode. It does kind of make me wonder if this season was aiming at a younger demographic. I wouldn't really be that surprised. And lastly, this season just isn't very funny, which is something I can say for an unfortunately high amount of seasons of SpongeBob. Even in the best episodes of this season, they're just not that funny. I went and watched some older episodes of SpongeBob just to test to see if maybe something happened to me and I just don't find the show funny at all, and no, the older seasons can still make me laugh. And not just in the best episodes, a lot of episodes can still make me laugh. You miss 100% of the shots you don't try, and it still feels like the show isn't really trying that hard to tell jokes, which is a big problem. In conclusion, Season 10 is a rather mixed bag. An unfortunately large portion of the season is spent rehashing old ideas in rather blatant ways. Sometimes they do it by taking an old idea and doing something slightly different with it, like in Unreal Estate or Krusty Katering, with rather mixed results. But then you have Housewarming, Plankton Gets the Boot, Plankton Retires, and SpongeBob's Place. One of the biggest sins that a show can commit is repeating itself. And if you do it about as much as this show does it, then I really do think that you should just stop making episodes. At least from an artistic standpoint, there's nothing more creatively bankrupt than just doing the same thing over and over again. That being said, I don't want to trash the season entirely because although there is a decent chunk that do feel like rehashed episodes, there is also another subset that feel like they are genuinely trying to bring something new and diverse to the table. Trident Trouble, Mimic Madness, even Code Yellow to an extent, not to mention Feral Friends, feel like episodes that are intentionally trying to do something different. And then of course you have a whole slew of episodes that aren't quite rehashed old ideas, but are also not particularly fresh or interesting themselves. Frankly, SpongeBob is in a rut, and although I see small signs of them trying to break out of it, I don't really have a ton of hope that they can do that. My prediction is that this is the status quo for SpongeBob going forward. There's going to be a handful of episodes in every season that try to break the mold, and those will tend to be the best episodes. There'll be a sad amount of just rehashed ideas, and a large chunk of things that are just kind of forgettable. But of course, I'd love to be proven wrong on that. The weird thing is that experimentation doesn't always work, especially when it comes to a show like SpongeBob. But in these past few seasons, it seems like almost every time they try to do something experimental and different, it works out. Of course, not literally every episode can be experimental, but since they have such a good track record with those episodes, I think they should definitely try more and more. And I have a lot of people to thank for helping make this season review possible. First of all, a huge thank you to Kuro the artist for making this new version of the PyCons. These are the 3.0 models, and I could not be happier with them. Seriously, show some love for Kuro down in the comments. I'd also like to thank Aaron, who made the original design for the PyCons, Quazzle for helping out with the background slide design for Season 10, and Nikki, the imaginative artist, artist who gave me pointers and support, because this season I decided to draw all of the slide pictures myself. Aside from the PyCons and a little bit of the background, I did almost every single piece of art in this video, and I am certainly no artist, so thank you, Nikki, for the encouragement. And thank you to Wile E. Coyote for providing me with his music track to use during the special slide for this season. I'd also like to thank my Patreon backers. Recently, I relaunched my Patreon on a per-month basis, so if you'd like to get your name in the credits of all of my videos, aside from the recast, as well as being able to join my private Discord server and some other perks, please donate if you can. And of course, thanks to my legacy Patreon donators as well. Well, there you go, folks. I've reviewed 10 seasons of SpongeBob. I have spent over 10 hours of video time talking about this show in just this series alone, not including Spongy Bits or Square Theory or my episode pitches or anything that I've ever done. There's probably a lot more hours than that, but I have spent so much time analyzing this show, and I feel like maybe now is the time to call it quits. I mean, what real reason is there to continue on to season 11? Aside from pleasing my fans, continuing on a project that I promised that I would finish, checking out the series to maybe possibly see if it could surprise me and be good again, or at least maybe bad in a really interesting way. Yeah, no, there's really no other reason aside from those, so I think it is time to call it quits. I'm going to go find a nice retirement center for YouTubers who have given up on their big main projects that everyone loves. So with that, PIEGUYRULZ out.